Hey guys, tonight we step into a world of lace curtains, coal fires, and the ever-present dread of a window left just slightly ajar. It's the late 1800s. You're in a middle-class Victorian home, and something as simple as letting in a gust of fresh air could earn you a stern lecture or worse, a reputation for recklessness. You're standing in the parlor now. It smells faintly of furniture polish, camphor, and something else. Musty, maybe. The heavy drapes are drawn tight, even though it's midday. And you can feel the sun trying and failing to make its way through all that velvet and tassel. The air is still, close, and warm, oppressive, even. You want desperately to crack open a window. Just a little, but don't you dare. This isn't your house. You're a guest. And besides, everyone knows what happens when a draft catches you off guard. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere interesting, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far we travel together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You ease into an embroidered armchair, careful not to wrinkle your skirt sore. If you're one of the many domestic servants in this home, careful not to linger long enough for anyone to notice. The parlor is the pride of the Victorian household, the first impression room, where dried flower arrangements stand stiffly in vases, and decorative doilies are monitored with silent precision. The goal here isn't comfort, it's control. Everything in this room, from the antimacassars to the faint odor of carbolic soap, exists to preserve a sense of sealed-off respectability. And sealed is the operative word. Windows are more for display than use. They are often locked, or worse, painted shut. There might be 24 panes of glass in a single room, but not one will let in a breeze. A housewife of the time would rather tolerate coal smoke than a rogue gust of wind. You shift in your seat and glance toward the tall sash window. The curtain sways not from wind, but from someone passing by. It's terrifying how quiet everything is, but to your host, this is the sound of peace, of control. The absence of air movement was considered not just a preference but a medical necessity. A still room was a healthy room, according to the household manuals. The advice was clear: keep the air inside and the outside world firmly out. Historians still argue whether this obsession with stagnant interiors was more about class, cleanliness, or sheer misinformation, but the result was the same. You lived inside a carefully sealed jar. Victorian women, especially housewives, were told constantly that their moral worth and domestic skill were reflected in the stillness of their air. Any hint of draft could signal laziness, ignorance, or even scandal. You didn't just clean the house. You regulated its microclimate with the vigilance of a submarine engineer. In public health manuals and etiquette books, the dangers of drafts were not up for debate. A window left open overnight was seen as an open invitation for disease, discomfort, or worse. You'll read that a breeze could cause pleurisy, lumbago, even facial paralysis, a sudden chill that might result in death. But a slow one, respectable, drawn out, thoroughly miserable. You glance at the fire grate, even on summer evenings. A small coal fire might be kept burning not just for warmth but to maintain the flow of safe, heated air. You're reminded again of the contradictions. In this setup, coal dust was rampant, air quality was terrible, but somehow a light summer breeze was the real threat. Let's not forget the layered symbolism of air in this era. For a housewife, controlling the air was another extension of managing the home's morality. Fresh air was unpredictable. It came from outside, out there where city smells, foreign ideas, and working-class germs lived. By contrast, indoor air, thick with starch, soot, and lavender water, was cultivated. If you let in a breeze, what else might you be letting in? One anecdote may be apocryphal, maybe not, involves a London matron who refused to let the windows be opened during a family illness, believing it would invite the fever further in. When a nurse cracked a window in secret, the woman reportedly collapsed in a faint, not from the air itself, but from the breach of protocol. And while you sit here, you might be wondering, weren't people hot? Yes, they were. Summers could be brutal, corseted, petticoated, and burdened with high collars and modesty layers. Housewives suffered through entire seasons in stifling silence. Perspiration wasn't just uncomfortable, it was vaguely indecent. Better to suffer with dignity than air the room and risk a rogue wind triggering a scandal. If you lived in the countryside, you might have a bit more leeway. Windows could be opened discreetly, perhaps with netting to block insects and a cautious eye on sudden changes in weather. But in the cities, you may as well open a sewer grate, with urban smog, chimney smoke, and the occasional manure cart rolling. past, the air outside was often worse than in. The irony? You might think you're being health conscious by keeping the windows shut, but in doing so, you're essentially preserving a little slice of Victorian biohazard. Still, you don't dare complain. The housewife's duty was to endure. That meant the headaches, the sleepless nights, the sweaty afternoons spent mending by lamplight. And if you felt faint, well, maybe you'd earn a short rest on the fainting couch, though even that came with expectations. You were expected to faint delicately with decorum, and then return promptly to supervising the maid or boiling your husband's undergarments. By now, the parlor air has taken on a character of its own, warm, a little sour, vaguely floral with a sharp note of coal smoke. You're lightheaded, but not unpleasantly so. Maybe that's just the effect of a society that measured wellness by how still you could keep the air. You decide to explore the house a little further, weaving your way past the parlor and into the dimly lit hallway. The air doesn't change. It just sits there, like a polite guest who doesn't know when to leave. And as you reach for the door to the back garden just to test it, to see if someone might have forgotten to bolt it shut, you hear the voice of a stern housekeeper. Behind you, mind the draft. Ah yes, the dreaded draft, spelled with that antiquated flourish that makes it sound even more dangerous. It wasn't just a breeze, it was a threat, a whisper of death slipping under the door frame, snaking across the floor, and lodging itself directly into your spine. Victorians were obsessed with the idea of miasma, the theory that disease was carried through foul air, particularly air that smelled off. Before germ theory gained traction, people genuinely believed that a whiff of putrid matter, think sewers, garbage, or the floral decay of overripe fruit, could carry cholera, consumption, or worse. This wasn't just superstition. It was the reigning scientific consensus for most of the 19th century. You open the garden door just a crack and are met with a gust of cool air. It's actually quite pleasant, but in your current role, it's also wildly inappropriate. The prevailing belief was that moving air, even if it smelled fine, carried illness because of its velocity. If a breeze could be felt, it could penetrate the skin, seep into the joints, and wreak havoc from the inside out. Doctors and scientists of the time, bless them, were known to recommend sealing windows and stuffing gaps with cloth, anything to prevent dangerous emanations. Entire medical treatises were written on how to avoid sleeping near a cracked window, lest a cold wind slip into your lungs like a criminal under cover of darkness. Historians still argue whether this paranoia stemmed more from upper-class Victorian ideals of bodily control or simple fear of the unknown. But either way, it had real consequences. You could easily find yourself shamed, scolded, or outright dismissed from service for opening a window without permission. Let's say you're not a housewife tonight. Let's say you're a servant girl, young, barely literate, and terrified of doing anything wrong. It's early morning, and your duty is to light the hearth before the lady of the house descends for breakfast. You slip quietly into the drawing room and immediately feel it, the chill, the stagnant air. You think, what harm could a little air do? You lift the sash an inch. The breeze is heavenly. Then creak, you turn around to find the butler staring at you like you've just opened a portal to the underworld. You scramble to close it, heart racing. That single breath of air might now be blamed for Lady Wensleydale's fainting spell later that day, or the onset of young Edmund's lingering cough. The guilt, the risk, the presumption, how dare you let the outside in? It didn't help that fresh air often came with a side of horse manure, coal dust, or questionable aromas from the neighbor's kitchen. In cities like London or Manchester, the very concept of outside air was negotiable. You might get a breeze, but it came wrapped in the fine particulates of 10,000 chimneys. And so, the idea took hold. Bad smells meant bad health. The scent became the sickness. Breezes were blamed for everything from typhoid to toothaches. And it wasn't just the lay people who bought into this. Many doctors doubled down on draft dread. Some recommended specially designed screens or cloth draft excluders to be tucked under doors and windows. Entire catalogs sold accessories for warding off malevolent breezes, Victorian home goods, if you will. But here's the odd bit. The same people terrified of cool, circulating air would sometimes place pans of vinegar around the room to purify the atmosphere. The logic: strong smells repelled miasma. You've got to admire the confidence. One particularly quirky invention was the fumigator bellows, which looked like a set of fireplace tools but was used to puff burning herbs into corners of the room, presumably to chase away bad air. The herbs didn't do much for cholera, but your parlor now smelled like scorched sage and lavender. So at least it felt cleaner. You make your way up the stairs now, the carpet thick beneath your shoes, muffling each step. The windows on the landing are adorned with elaborate curtains, more velvet, more tassels, more determination to let no air in or out. You pause by one, peeking past the brocade. Outside, the garden is blooming. You can hear birdsong, distant carriage wheels, and the faint hum of summer. But inside, the air feels like it's been here since last autumn. The fear of nighttime drafts was even worse. In many homes, windows were triple locked at sundown. Bedroom doors were shut tight, fireplaces left to smolder. The belief was that your body, at rest, was particularly vulnerable. A breeze across your neck could lead to neuralgia. Cold feet, that was practically an omen. Many Victorian housewives went to bed in full flannel armor, nightgowns, shawls, sometimes even gloves to defend themselves from the imagined onslaught of invisible poisons, carried in on the wind. One woman, legend has it, was so terrified of night air that she had her windows sealed with wax, not caulk. Wax. She died. Eventually, but not from a draft. Just from being human. And yet, for all this paranoia, no one seemed especially concerned about other, more pressing risks: lead pipes, arsenic wallpaper, open gas jets. The real dangers were often unseen and unacknowledged. But a cracked window, a cool touch of air across the forehead, that was the enemy you could feel. And so you lie in a stifling bedroom, under a mountain of bed covers, barely able to breathe. Your candle flickers, then dims. Outside, a breeze stirs the leaves. Inside, the silence holds firm. Morning comes, but you wouldn't know it. The bedroom is still cloaked in a soft, amber half-darkness, the curtains thick enough to block both sun and sanity. You're up before the household, creeping down to the scullery to prepare the day's first round of boiling water. The windows are still closed, of course, sealed, even, as if the outside world might burst in and start rearranging the furniture. You're about to discover what fresh air fears look like on the sweatiest stage of all, the Victorian laundry routine. It begins with the fire. You stoke it, carefully, until the water in the massive copper cauldron bubbles like a miniature volcano. The room fills with heat, thick steam clinging to every surface. From your reddening cheeks to the soot-black ceiling above, you're drenched. In minutes, sleeves rolled, hair damp, apron sticking to your chest. But don't even think about opening the window, because this is where fresh air collides with another Victorian fear: sweat. Not only was perspiration seen as unclean, it was often considered a sign of poor moral hygiene. A lady who glistened in polite company was already teetering on the edge of scandal, and if she openly sweated, Lord help her, she may as well confess to gambling or fornication. A proper woman kept dry, fragrant, and mildly uncomfortable at all times, even in working-class homes where physical labor couldn't be avoided. Sweat was something to be managed, not aired out. Ventilation was seen not as a relief but as a weakness and indulgence. Better to endure the sweat silently than risk a chill. Historians still argue whether this strict avoidance of bodily processes came from religious roots or simple British stubbornness. But either way, the outcome was the same: tight collars, heavy skirts, and zero airflow. And now we turn to laundry itself, a sacred act of purification that somehow managed to be both hellishly hot and morally symbolic. Soap in the Victorian era wasn't just for cleaning. It was a statement: strong-smelling, caustic, sometimes containing bleach or carbolic acid. It was used to strip garments of every trace of life: oils, skin, scent, and especially sweat. Clothes weren't just scrubbed clean, they were boiled into submission. You lean over the washboard, knuckles raw, wrist aching. The steam rises in waves, bringing with it the sharp scent of lye and lavender water. Your shift clings to your back like a second skin. Outside, the garden is sunlit and breezy, but inside, you're pickling yourself. Every now and then, you glance toward the small, grimy window above the sink. It's bolted, of course. You wouldn't open it even if you could. You've heard the stories. There was that one housemaid, remember? Who got a cough after hanging linens outside on a windy day. She swore she was fine, but within a week she was gone. The breeze got into her lungs, they said, nodding solemnly. Took her fast. Never mind that she likely had untreated tuberculosis. Never mind that half the city's water supply was laced with cholera. In Victorian homes, it was always the wind that got you. And let's not forget the obsession with smell. Deodorant, as we know it, didn't exist yet. Perfumes were often alcohol-based and applied liberally to both clothes and handkerchiefs. Ladies might carry Pomander's tiny scent balls filled with herbs, or citrus peel just to ward off unpleasant odors. So, what happened when someone did notice a whiff of body odor? Simple. They blamed the air. It was always easier to say the room smelled off than to suggest someone hadn't properly laundered their underthings. You leave the washhouse now. Finally finish scrubbing sheets and undergarments until your arms feel like overcooked noodles. The air in the hallway is no better. The sweat on your skin has dried to a faint, salty itch. You want to stand in the garden. You want the wind to touch your skin like a cool blessing. But no, you are instead handed a lavender sachet to tuck under your corset. Let's talk about those corsets, by the way. A typical Victorian housewife wore one for up to 16 hours a day, made of tightly stitched cotton and steel boning. Corsets were designed not only to shape the waist but to restrict the diaphragm, because breathing deeply was considered unladylike. You were meant to glide, not gasp. Add to that several layers of underclothing, a petticoat or two, possibly a bustle, and a high-neck blouse buttoned to the throat. This wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a system of insulation. Victorian women were literally wrapped in anxiety. And should you get too warm in all this? The answer was not loosen your clothing. It was, drink a little vinegar tonic. Sit down and fan yourself gently until the urge to pass out subsided. You're beginning to realize something important. The fear of fresh air wasn't just about health. It was about control of the body, the home. The image projected to others. Air was wild. It crept in. It rustled curtains. It smelled of things not scrubbed or steamed. It was unpredictable and, therefore, deeply un-Victorian. There's one account, often cited in women's letters from the 1870s, of a new bride who opened a window in her parlor during a tea visit. The breeze caught a doily and sent it fluttering to the floor. Her mother-in-law reportedly fainted on the spot, and the poor woman spent the next month apologizing in person and by letter. The doily survived, but the reputation did not. Still, cracks were beginning to form, both literal and cultural. Toward the late 19th century, reformers began to speak quietly about the importance of ventilation. Doctors started noticing that well-aired hospitals saw fewer infections. Some schools experimented with airing rooms where children were encouraged to breathe deeply. Radicals. But for now, you return to the parlor. The lace curtains hang like ghosts. The tea has gone cold. And outside, the wind still blows patient, soft, and utterly uninvited. You're back in the parlor, but something feels different now. Maybe it's you. Maybe. After hours of sweating in the scullery, scrubbing clothes while fully dressed in the textile equivalent of an upholstered piano bench, you've developed a new appreciation for that mythical beast, the cross breeze. But don't get ahead of yourself. Before the Victorian housewife welcomed fresh air, she had to fight for it, sometimes quite literally. You head upstairs again, past the dim hallway and into the bedrooms, where the real war over windows was often waged. This was the private domain where mothers, daughters, and aunts maintained their quiet rituals. But it was also a battleground, one window latch at a time. Imagine this. You're newly married, and your husband likes to sleep with the window open. You, however, were raised to believe that sleeping in night air is how your cousin Madeline got consumption, and your Aunt Petunia went bald. The first night is a compromise, window shut, curtain pulled back. The second night, he unlatches it after you fall asleep. By the third night, you've nailed it shut and told the maid to keep a lookout. It sounds petty, but in Victorian households, these debates were high stakes. A draft at night wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The bedroom was meant to be a sealed chamber, a sanctuary against illness. People wore nightcaps not just for warmth, but because they believed cold air could sneak in through their ears and cause madness, toothaches, or brain fever. Historians still argue whether these fears were rooted more in outdated medical science or gendered power dynamics, but what's clear is this: the window was never just a window. It was a symbol of who had control over the body, the room, and by extension the household itself. One particularly infamous case appeared in an 1880s etiquette column. A woman wrote in to say her husband insisted on sleeping with a window cracked in winter. She'd taken to sleeping with a scarf over her face and feared for her female organs. The columnist advised her to stand her ground and not let modern fancy undermine womanly health. You crack a smile just a little. Womanly health, as defined in the Victorian age, was less about actual wellness and more about propriety. You could be fainting daily, struggling to breathe through thick layers of clothing. But if you were upright, laced tight, and smelled of rosewater, you were deemed perfectly fine. And when it came to raising children, the ventilation anxiety doubled. Nurseries were often kept airtight and toasty, with windows closed, chimneys blocked, and babies bundled like little wool-wrapped dumplings. The idea of letting a breeze into a child's room was considered borderline criminal. One Victorian child-rearing manual warns sternly, do not let the night air enter, lest the child's humors become unsettled. And yet, children still got sick. A recurring debate from this period involved the phenomenon of night terrors, now understood as a common childhood sleep disorder. At the time, it was sometimes attributed to breezes crossing the child's pillow. A solution: position the bed in the middle of the room, no walls, no corners. Just lots of thick furniture to break any air currents. Because obviously, that makes more sense than looking into your child's sugar intake. Even among the servants, window tension ran high. Maids were sometimes instructed to air out rooms only when no one was home, and even then, only for precisely 7 minutes. Just enough to avoid suspicion, but not long enough to let in a full outbreak of pleurisy. Some households enforced strict ventilation hours, where windows were allowed to open for a predetermined time, often between 2 o'clock and 3 p.m. You had to open them precisely and close them just as carefully, lest you unbalance the air quality and invite catastrophe. Think of it like a Victorian purge cycle for air. Of course, not everyone bought into the paranoia. By the mid to late 19th century, a quiet rebellion had begun to stir. Reform-minded doctors started promoting the benefits of fresh air, especially in the treatment of tuberculosis. These were the early murmurs of a movement that would eventually swing the pendulum in the other direction. But for now, you're still in a house where closing a window is an act of maternal love, and opening one might get you a stern look over the top of someone's teacup. Even furniture was designed to reflect this. Heavy curtains weren't just decorative, they were air baffles. Elaborate portieres, that's a fancy curtain hung in a doorway, helped block airflow between rooms. Bed canopies? Not just for romance, they were fortress walls against ceiling drafts. You paused in one of the bedrooms, staring up at the ceiling rose where a chandelier used to hang. The air in here is thick, almost syrupy. The floral wallpaper has yellowed slightly with age, and you swear it smells faintly of camphor and old starch. You feel your throat tighten. You could cough, but you don't. You don't want to cause alarm. Better to just excuse yourself than pretend your body is, like the air in this room, perfectly still. And here's the thing. The fear of fresh air didn't always come from ignorance. Sometimes it came from trauma. The 19th century was riddled with disease outbreaks, cholera, diphtheria, smallpox, and in many cases, no one really knew how these things spread. It made sense, in a tragic way, to fear the things you could control. If illness came in through the windows, you could close them. If it came through your water or your doctor's unwashed hands, well, that was harder to handle. So window battles continued. Quiet, unspoken, mostly maternal. You imagine a housewife slipping into her child's room in the dead of night, gently nudging the window latch shut, smoothing the covers, and whispering, "There now, no cold wind will get you." And even if she knew, in some part of her mind, that air alone wouldn't harm him, it still felt like safety. But time, like a breeze through a broken latch, finds a way in. You're standing now in the garden of a late Victorian home, not quite Edwardian, not yet modern. But things are shifting. The house behind you still has its heavy curtains and lace antimacassars, but the windows, 1 or 2 of them, are open, just a crack, enough to let the lilac-scented air drift through. And this time, no one's fainting. It started small. A physician here, a reformer there. Someone noticed that patients in crowded, sealed hospital wards tended to fare worse than those in rural infirmaries with wide windows and fresh air. The growing awareness of germ theory, thanks to folks like Pasteur and Lister, began to unravel the old miasma myths. Doctors started writing about ventilation instead of bad air. They talked about airflow, oxygen, clean air, real, measurable things, instead of just smells and vibes. It was revolutionary and terrifying for many housewives. It wasn't easy to let go of beliefs passed down from mothers and grandmothers, but it became harder to ignore the mounting evidence that sunlight, clean bedding, and yes, airflow, actually made people healthier. And then came tuberculosis. It was everywhere by the late 19th century. Consumption, they called it, with its long, poetic decay. For a time, the illness had been romanticized in art and literature. Think pale heroines coughing delicately into embroidered handkerchiefs. But when it reached epidemic levels, romanticism gave way to urgency. Fresh air suddenly became prescription. Enter the sanatorium movement. Across Europe and North America, doctors began sending TB patients into the mountains, the countryside, anywhere the air was dry and plentiful. In these new health resorts, patients were encouraged to eat, rest, and most radically sleep outside. Balconies, verandas, screened porches. Some sanatoriums even wheeled beds outdoors in the middle of winter. Imagine how that sounded to a woman who'd spent her life sealing every window shut by dusk. It was scandalous, but it was working. Soon, the open-air craze spilled over into city life. Progressive schools were built with giant windows that were never closed. Fresh-air classrooms became all the rage. Public health campaigns started advocating for open windows, even in winter. There were posters, lectures, pamphlets, air your rooms daily. They insisted. Sunlight and ventilation save lives. Historians still debate whether the shift was driven more by public health science or rising fears of urban overcrowding, but the impact was undeniable. For the first time, Victorian women were being told to open their homes, not seal them like tombs. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some older women clung stubbornly to their scented sachets and curtain weights. They'd spent decades fearing breezes and changing that overnight wasn't easy. There's a letter from 1905 in which a London matron laments, "My daughter insists on opening the nursery window each morning. I do fear the cold will kill them all, but the girl went to nursing school, and I must trust her." It's a tiny moment, but a telling one. The generational divide. The tug of habit versus hope. You picture that young nurse, probably not much older than 20, standing in her starch white uniform, hands on the window frame, feeling the morning air rush in. It smells like coal smoke, yes, but also lavender and grass. And for the first time in a long time, no one's yelling about the draft. Even home design began to shift. Architects started incorporating wider windows, air vents, and cross-ventilation principles. Curtains grew lighter. Louvres and transoms appeared in hallways. Some homes even had built-in sunroom spaces designed for lounging in sunlight and fresh air. It was the ultimate Victorian heresy, comfort and health. At the same time, and still, the memory of the old fears lingered. There were households where the front windows opened every morning, religiously, but only for 5 minutes. Others where the sanatorium-style sleeping porch was built, but rarely used, just in case, because habits formed in fear are not easily unlearned. And yet, air kept coming. You step back into the house now, but it feels different. Someone has opened a sash window in the dining room. The curtains fluttered just slightly in the afternoon breeze. Dust motes swirl like soft sparks. A maid walks past without even blinking. It's a small miracle. The same room that once bristled with fear at the idea of moving air is now finally letting the world in. Asterisk, and now, the house is still again, but this time, not because the air is sealed tight, but because everything feels settled. The curtains stir softly in the breeze. Outside, the garden hums with quiet life. A bumblebee visits the lavender bush, somewhere far off. A cart rattles over cobblestone. But here, in this room, all is calm. You rest in a wide, creaking chair, the kind with just enough give to feel like a warm embrace. The floorboards beneath you stretch gently, warming in the late sun. The wallpaper, faded with age, seems to glow gold at the edges. The air that moves through the room is light, cool, and kind. And you breathe. It's strange to think that something as simple as a breath, something we do without effort, was once a matter of control, of fear, of strict moral code. That a single crack in a window frame could divide families, summon arguments, stir generations of warning. But not tonight. Tonight, the air moves gently over your skin like the passing of time. Each inhale, a ribbon unspooling. Each exhale, a little more of the past dissolving. The house rests with you. No secrets, no stiffness. Just softness and air and stillness of a different kind. Let it hold you now. Let the breeze carry away the weight of starched collars and shuttered rooms. Let it move gently through your thoughts, leaving only quiet. Drift. Float. Sleep.